He's out on his book tour right now, out in L.A. today, one of the great sports writers, of course, with Sports Illustrated. You see him on Brian Gumbel's HBO sports show, also hear him on NPR, and a great pleasure to welcome Frank Deford with us today. His new book is called Overtime, My Life as a Sports Writer. And Frank, thanks for joining us tonight. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, gentlemen.
Well, I'll tell you, Frank, it's and I've said this many times, excuse me, it's a great life if you're fortunate enough to do what you want to do all your life, and I think there are very few people that can walk away at the end of a career or near the end of a career and said every day was a pleasure, this is exactly what I wanted to do.
I think that's a pretty accurate appraisal. There were a few days there when the airplanes weren't flying or the weather was bad, but generally speaking, you're absolutely right. I'm very blessed in the career that I've had.
And Don, you and I were just talking before we went on the air. I didn't realize this. Why don't you kind of tell the listeners? I know we kind of mentioned it to Frank a little bit before we went on the air, but you have a connection, or at least a relative of yours has a connection with Frank.
Yeah, in the very early days, my aunt was very much connected with Sports Illustrated. She was fortunate enough to work for Time Incorporated, and when they came up with the concept of an all-sports magazine, although it's changed a little bit now than what it was years ago, but she was on the ground floor and enjoyed it very, very much. And I know that she was connected with Frank. He talked about it a little bit ago, and so they have a little history together, right, Frank?
Yeah, she was sort of my first boss. She was in charge of all the reporters. Her name was Honor Fitzpatrick, and we called it the bullpen. Those of us, it was the lowest of the low. You were down there checking and researching. That's how I started. But luckily, I could move on from there very quickly. So as much as I adored Honor, I was glad to get away from her.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, when you look over your entire career, and, you know, it's just amazing to pinpoint. Imagine there are a couple of things that you point out in the book. As I mentioned when we started the show, Doug's had a chance to get the book. I have not as yet, and so I'll be very interested to read it. But how about a couple of little things to start us off that come to the top of your mind?
Well, what I tried to do was to talk about myself. You have to do that. If you're going to write a memoir, you have to talk about yourself. But I always figured the people that I met and worked with through the years were a whole lot more interesting than I was. And so I tried as much as possible to write, yes, about myself, but my affiliation, my association with athletes, going back to, well, really the first one was Bill Bradley, because Bradley was a freshman at Princeton when I was a senior there. So I like to say that I discovered Bradley, but even better, as I've told Bill through the years, he gave my career a real springboard, because I told everybody at Sports Illustrated about this unknown kid, and when he turned out to be even better than that, it made me look very, very smart indeed.
Well, Butch Van Bredikoff knew how good he was, because at that time I lived right outside of Princeton, worked for a radio station in Trenton, and so I had a chance to see probably 90% of Bill's games, and got the opportunity, as you did, to interview him and talk to him, and he's a fascinating person.
But he was tucked away then. In those old days, the freshmen weren't allowed to play on the varsity. So Bill was. So I saw him as a freshman. That's where I got the jump on everybody else. And they actually let me at Sports Illustrated. One of the very first stories that I wrote about was about Bill, and so he turned out, as I said, to be even more extraordinary than I had promised. So I guess Bradley was the beginning of my professional career, and he certainly has lived up to everything, and there were a lot more to follow.
As I say, that's a great place to start. Bill Bradley was just a unique individual, and I'll tell you,
sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. That's an old expression, but it certainly was true, or to be in the right place at the right time. And I had that happen a few times. And
well, I think it happened to him, because he could have gone to Duke very easily instead of going to Princeton, and that would have changed not only you, but that would have changed him as well.
My whole life. If Bradley had gone to Duke, it would change my whole life. Well, I hope that my success did not hinge entirely on Bill Bradley. I was very lucky, I said, being in the right place at the right time, because when I got to Sports Illustrated, there was nobody there who was much interested in basketball. It was kind of looked down upon. And I got the opportunity very early on, many thanks to Mr. Bradley, to become the basketball writer. And so at a very early age, I was covering, the NBA and college basketball both. And those were fascinating times. The NBA was really a struggling backwater enterprise, but there were some great ball players and guys who could be stars today, and not only that, very intriguing, very, very interesting guys. Russell, Elgin Baylor, Jerry West, Oscar Robertson. Pretty good crowd.
I agree. I wish they'd mention Elgin Baylor a little bit more often. I broadcast the 76ers for a great number of years, and so I had a chance to see everybody along the line, and George McGinnis and Doc and the rest. But Elgin Baylor always comes to mind when they talk about the greatest, forwards in the game. Sometimes he gets overlooked, and I can't understand how that's possible.
Well, I think it's because he came so early, and he never did win a championship. He was always in the shadow of the Celtics, and how many times they made the finals. And the saddest thing about Baylor is that the year that he retired, he finally was just so old, and he quit in like October, early in the season. And that was the year the Lakers went on to win finally a championship. He missed. I think they won 33 in a row that year.
Right.
Yeah.
It was right after Elgin finally quit, only because he'd just grown old. But Gil Goodrich,
right after Wilt got there.
It was a couple of years. Everybody thought as soon as Wilt got there they would win, but they didn't. They didn't win right away.
No.
Matter of fact, I write a lot about Wilt in the book because I had a very interesting relationship with Wilt. I didn't really like Wilt in the beginning. He didn't like me. He threw me out of a locker room once. Not bodily, of course, or I wouldn't be here. But I really didn't get to know Wilt until after he was finished playing, he was an intriguing guy. As I say in the book, in overtime, he's the only great athlete I know who seemed to be happier when his playing days were over. So much was expected of Wilt. It was as if he just could not live up to everything that was expected of him, and I think he was more comfortable when he was finally finished playing and could enjoy life.
I'd have to agree with that. I think that, of course, I follow him from Overbrook High right on through, and I would have to agree with you that Alex Hannon could control him a little bit better than anybody else could, but Wilt was his own person, and I think he had a lot of confusion within himself as to exactly what he wanted to do and when he wanted to do it, and I agree with you. He's much more relaxed. If you saw him at a tennis tournament or you saw him somewhere after he retired, he was much more amiable to talk to and to sort of get a laugh from.
You're right about Alex Hannon. Hannon was there were always stories that they had come to blows. I never believed that because I don't think Wilt was that confrontational. And it's like so many big guys, he was not looking for a fight. But the year that Hannon was the coach, he was coach of Wilt twice, once out in San Francisco and then back in Philadelphia. And the year that they finally broke Russell's streak and won 67, I want to say. That might have been the greatest team ever. That was an extraordinary team. Billy Cunningham, who's a Hall of Famer, came off the bench.
That's right. He was the sixth man. They voted it the team of the first 50 years.
Well, I'm not surprised at that. Chet Walker and Luke Jackson were the two. I remember the two starting forwards, and then Cunningham came in, and Larry Costello, who was sort of the last of the set shots,
right,
was one of the guards, and Hal Greer, who was another Hall of Famer, was the other. I mean, that was just an extraordinary team. But
and Bianchi was on that team, and he didn't play very much, but he was a contributor. He was a contributor.
But that was Wilt's first championship, and it took a little bit of the sting out of all the business of how he was a loser, which really dated back to when North Carolina beat Kansas in the 1957 championship in triple overtime. So
Yeah.
Wilt is a major figure in my book, and one of the more intriguing athletes that I met through the years.
Doug?
Tom with Frank Deford. Name of the book is called Overtime, My Life as a Sports Writer. And Frank, I mentioned before we went on, enjoyed reading the book. Great stories, similar to you talking about Wilt Chamberlain. You talk about your friendship and covering the great Arthur Ashe, another tremendous figure, not only in sports, but culturally and kind of politically, what he kind of went through, what he stood for. Can you tell a story or two about Arthur Ashe?
Well, certainly. I think I was probably closer to Arthur than any other athlete, and we went together to South Africa when he broke the color line there. I traveled with him and really lived with him, and that was in 1973, and it was a major, earth-shaking, one could say, event in South Africa. It was the first time that the South Africans had ever allowed a black to be in competition with whites. And there was a major tournament in those days, the South African Open. I mean, it was not just a rinky-dink thing. Connors won the tournament, beat Ashe in the finals, but much more important than that was the fact that Arthur was this pioneer, and
Right.
because of what he did, open that curtain just a little bit, let the sunshine in. The South Africans were never able to close it back up again, and it was only another 20 years or so before Nelson Mandela, a black man, was the president of South Africa. And at the time that Arthur went, the idea that would have been the case, nobody in the world would have believed that. So it was a significant event. You know, we as sports writers get to cover big games. It's not very often that we get to cover something that's really truly big, and that was one occasion where I had that opportunity.
You know, it's interesting because for all the years that you followed golf, Gary Player was always a little bit criticized because he never really opened it up. He was a great, tremendous golfer and a tremendous person, and seemed to be very liberal in all his ideas, but was never really a spokesman for opening it up.
Well, it was very difficult for any South African to go against his government. It really was a closed shop at that time. There were a couple of tennis players, Cliff Drysdale and Ray Moore, and they were pretty outspoken, but they also left the country.
Right.
Both of them became American citizens, and I think most people South Africans had to make that decision that if they were going to stay in South Africa, they had to pretty much support apartheid, whether or not they did conscientiously, they did and publicly, and Player made that decision for himself. But Arthur did change things. He was a significant cultural figure. There's no question in my mind. He and Billie Jean King, who was pretty much his contemporary, it's sort of odd that the two tennis players were the ones who played such a sociological role, but they did.
And not only the political aspect of Arthur Ashe, but obviously the tragedy, unfortunately, of going through the health issues with the heart problem, and then the transfusion, which unfortunately gave him the AIDS. But the way he handled that whole thing with the class and dignity really, I think, helped a lot of people going through that at that time. Or actually, that was kind of the beginning of what we heard about AIDS.
It was, I can only describe Arthur as noble. I don't think I would apply that to many people, but he was. And also, he told a few people when he found out that he had AIDS, and he said, asked us to keep it in secret. But like all secrets, the word began to get out. And a lot of reporters, several of them anyway, found out. But they kept the secret even though they weren't bound to, because of their respect and their affection for Arthur. I think it's amazing in this journalistic world we're always looking for scoops, that here these writers had a great scoop, and kept it to themselves, and that was really an honor to Arthur Ashe. He when it was finally revealed by USA Today that he did have AIDS, he only had a few months to live, as it turned out, and I think he found out during that short period of time how beloved he was. The outpouring for him was extraordinary. So I was just very, very lucky to be covering tennis, which, was not the most major of sports, but I was covering it at a time when so many important things were happening. This is the 40th anniversary of Title IX, and, of course, Billie Jean King played such an important role in bringing little girls into sports.
Boy, did she ever.
She really did. I mean, she really changed the attitude of the way both men and women look at sports. And she's, I think, along with Jackie Robinson, as important a figure as we've ever had in sports.
Frank Deford is our guest. Over Time, My Life as a Sportswriter is the name of the book. And, of course, long-time association with Sports Illustrated. But back in the early 90s, Frank, you went on to become the editor-in-chief of The National, which made a big splash, but unfortunately didn't last long. I thought it was a great paper, but I guess it was just kind of the cusp there of newspapers not quite being able to sustain themselves. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, that was, we made a splash, all right. We made a splash of red ink. We lost $150 million in 18 months. It was a noble experiment. Let's call it that. And I do think I'm probably the worst person to be the judge of the National, but I think that most people who read it thought it was a terrific product. Unfortunately, it was a disaster as a commercial enterprise. We couldn't deliver it. That's what really sunk
Was
the
it
National.
the mailing subscriptions, Frank? Or
Oh, no, it's not mailing.
Because
If you were mailing, that's easy. You just drop it in the mailbox. Anybody can do that. The trouble with newspapers is, though, that you have to have them on somebody's front step the next morning, and everybody wanted the late scores, too, and it just was spread too thin. It just cost too much money per issue to get it delivered. And the odd thing is that I remember being questioned about the potential success of the paper before it opened, and nobody really saw that. They all said, will you be able to get enough advertising? Will you be able to get enough readers? Are there that many people who really care? And all that. But nobody foresaw the distribution problems, which turned out to really sink our ship, which was too bad because I think we were a great product. We were sort of the last great newspaper adventure because it wasn't long after that the Internet came along and changed the whole newspaper landscape. But it was an amazing 2 years that I spent there, and we had a great camaraderie. That's all I can say. We were all very proud of what we did, and most of the guys went on to bigger and better jobs. It was a good mark. It was a gold mark against your name if you worked for the National.
Well, we've touched on a number of sports and a number of sports idols and sports celebrities. How about baseball? What's your top story on the baseball front?
I had a wonderful time with you're from Philadelphia with Richie Ashburn.
Oh boy,
Richie,
Whitey,
Whitey. I was doing a story on Bill Tilden, the great tennis player who, alas, was a pedophile, and nobody had ever really written about that while he was alive. And so this was about 15 years after Tilden was dead, and I was writing about it. And of course, Tilden was from Philadelphia, so I was spending a lot of time there. And one day, out of the blue, I get a call from Whitey, from Richie Ashburn. And I hadn't seen him since he had retired, 10 years before.
Right.
And he said, I understand you're doing the story on Tilden. I said, yeah. Well, it turned out that Richie Ashburn was from Tilden, Nebraska.
That's right.
And he was always fascinated by Bill Tilden because of that connection. And the other thing was that after his baseball career had ended, he had become a very good club tennis player. So he had interest in tennis, too.
And squash.
So he said, when are you coming back to Philadelphia again? And I said, I don't know, whatever it was, next Thursday. He says, well, would you like me to drive you around? And I said, sure. So for the next 2 or 3 days, my chauffeur was Rich Ashburn.
How about that?
It was off season. It was the middle of the winter. He was waiting to go to spring training as an announcer. He kind of looked like a chauffeur. He wore a little soft cap, and he smoked a pipe. And he was the best chauffeur I ever had. And we traveled all over Philadelphia together. I remember Whitey very, very fondly. We had a wonderful, wonderful time together.
I remember that story you wrote about Bill Tilden. And of course, everybody in Philadelphia, they had talked about it for years, but you were the first one that actually wrote anything.
Yeah, it embarrassed people in tennis, so they kind of pushed it under the rug. There's nothing that's named for Tilden. There's no honor. I mean, he's as far as tennis is concerned, he's a disgrace, even though he may have been, for his time, certainly the greatest player. He was absolutely extraordinary.
Well, you can say the same thing about Pancho Gonzalez, too. He was one of the great players of all time. And another guy that scared people.
Oh, man, he scared me. Oh, he just look at me, and I just would wilt. I mean, I remember one time I was seeing him in a tournament. This is back in the days when the pros are making, no money at all. It was all
right.
Amateur tennis and Gonzalez, and we're up at Newport, and he's playing somebody, and his wife shows up around the third game. I mean, it wasn't, and he stops right in the middle, and he looks at her in a loud voice. He says, "You'd be late for your own father's funeral." Oh my God! I mean,
I don't think Doug would remember, but there was a period of time when he was suspended, and
I read about that. Yeah.
I saw him practicing down in Florida. I was down in Florida at the time, and I was always a tennis enthusiast, although I wasn't as good as Whitey was. But I always loved to play with Whitey on the road, and so consequently, I had the pleasure of seeing Gonzalez a number of times and talking to him and so forth when he was suspended for that year and he couldn't play, and he was something, boy. I mean, he used practice balls, and he's the only guy I ever saw that actually split a ball. I mean, he actually. I never saw that happen with anybody. I've seen the greatest servers in the world, but I've never seen anybody to get. They were practice balls. They weren't tournament balls, but still, I never saw a guy actually break a ball except Gonzalez.
I believe it. He was a whale of a player, and he lost most of his best years because he was. He went pro when tennis was still a fake sport, was still a amateur sport, and it was a shame that was the case. But finally they made honest men and women out of tennis players. But it was a great sport to cover. I mean, because in basketball you go to Wichita, Kansas, and in tennis you go to Paris and London. Doesn't you want to figure that out?
Well, he became a pretty decent.
I saw a lot of the world covering tennis. It may not have been as big as football, but it sure got me to a lot of places.
Well, I'm about halfway through Unbroken right now, and quite a book and quite a story. And I didn't realize the similarities in the early part of the book. The secretary, she must be a consumed with speed, whether a racetrack or whether it's a human being.
Hey, Frank, what do you make of the whole bringing up to date with the Belmont last week? As a longtime sports writer, are you a little suspicious of what we saw with the scratch of
I'm not
another?
suspicious, but I tell you what, I did one of my pieces for NPR, and I said I didn't want the horse to win. I got nothing against the horse, but I think that after 34 years, this horse the trainer was under such a cloud of suspicion.
Yeah.
The owner was involved with all kinds of, never been caught, never been penalized or anything, but he was all, he'd been charged with usury in several states, and
right,
and it just not the best people. I'd love to see a Triple Crown winner, but I'd love to see one that just really represents the sport very well, and I don't think this horse did. As I say, I'm terribly, terribly sorry the horse broke down. and it would have been fabulous to have seen the horse try to win.
Right.
I don't know if he could. Nobody ever knows whether a horse can go a mile and a half. It looked like it had the breeding, but in many ways, the fact that we haven't had a Triple Crown winner in so long I think it's good for the sport, because if somebody won every couple of years, it wouldn't mean anything. So,
well, it's like waiting for the Chicago Cubs to win.
Yeah, that's right. People would lose interest in the Cubs if they won. That's right. Some things are meant to be. The Cubs are not meant to win, and the Triple Crown is meant to go on forever and ever and ever without a victor.
Well, the interesting thing, Phil Mushnick wrote a very, very strong column with your ideas in mind last week one day in the New York Post, and I have to agree with him. I mean, and agree with you both. There was just no way you could root for either the trainer or the owner. There was nothing positive about either one.
Exactly.
Frank, we have a phone caller. We have a caller, Frank. I want to ask you a question. G-Man, is that you on the line?
Hey, good evening, guys. Great to listen to you talk. It's good to hear the legends talk about the legends. And of course, in my case, I'm sitting here in a broken down recliner, and I guess no luck and no talent. So, but hey, sports really changing. It is good to hear about the legends, and yeah, I understand what you think about the horse. I have the same feeling on the horse, but I have real mixed emotions about what's happening in pro sports today. I'm sitting here watching the Boston Red Sox play in Miami, and there's hardly anybody in the crowd. The other day, the crowds were bad. Of course, the attendance at the race was down 25,000 for various reasons. And then I watched that little boxing match. What was that, Pacquiao there, and the decision with the umps. Do you see, and the refs, do you see, I don't think the sports are going to be nearly like they were back in the day. I hate to use that term, but I hear that a lot anymore about back in the day. And I'm from back in the day, so I can relate pretty good with that. So I'm concerned about the direction that sports are going, and what kind of legends are going to be made for the youngsters coming up today. That is one question I have. And one little quick comment. My dad was an amateur tennis player, and his biggest thrill is when this guy came to Indiana to play, and Dad played poncho, and had great memories about talking with him and warming up with him and getting his socks being off mine. So that was a wonderful memory. But anyway,
let's get Frank's thoughts on as he looks at the now and then. Frank, what about it?
Well, I think boxing is probably no better than it ever was. I mean, the number of scandals in boxing go back to the beginning of time. So I think it was, obviously I didn't see the fight, but from every account it was just disgraceful that they took the decision away from Pacquiao. But I think we've come to expect that from boxing over the years. And as far as sports today is concerned, it will create heroes. There's no question that kids will find their own heroes today, just as they always have. The sport is more commercial than it's ever been, yes, but it's also true that people get to see it. People see more sport because of television. It's more important in our lives. Right. And in that sense, it's a more substantial enterprise than it ever was before. And that's true all over the world. I mean, they're playing the European Cup in soccer right now, and for all the troubles in Europe, nobody cares about anything right now. Nobody cares if Spain's going bankrupt. They're caring how Spain is doing on a soccer pitch.
Yeah. Well, if you saw the result of that 1-1 tie yesterday, you know exactly how they feel.
Yeah. So I think sport is bigger than ever before, and it'll always create heroes, and it will also always create scandals. think anything's going to change that much.
Well, Frank, we could talk for hours with you, but I know you have a big book tour you're on, so we don't want to keep you any longer, but we appreciate your time. The name of the book is called Overtime, My Life as a Sports Writer. We're talking with Frank Deford today, and I guess available in all the bookstores. And you have a website, Frank? People could go to that as well?
Yes, I do. You go right to frankdefordbook.com, and you can read all about it there. And as you say, it's in every store and can be ordered from any Amazon or any of the other orders. So I hope you go out and read it, gentlemen.
Great. Frank,
Frank, let me ask you one last question before you go, and that would be with Gumbel. What about the HBO show? Have you enjoyed doing that? Is that something
I love doing it. I think it's great storytelling. It's always what I've been interested in doing. And no, I'm not telling a story with my computer or my typewriter, but I'm telling a story with television, and it's a wonderful. I think we tell some great stories, and it's a great show. I'm very proud.
Do you get to pick the stories?
I pick some of them, and some of them are developed by the producers. The obscure ones tend to be developed by the producers, and then every now and then. But it's, television is much more of a collegial enterprise than writing is. Writing is a much more personal, individual thing. But either way, the result is to tell good stories, and I hope we do that.
Well, I'll join Doug and say thank you very, very much for joining us, and I'll give Honor's daughter a call and tell her to pick up the book. She'll be thrilled that you got a little note in there about her.
Thank you very much, guys. Love talking to you.